Okay, so we are going to get started. We do have a quorum. We are missing a couple members today. So I did want to ask the committee whether you wanted to wait until the next meeting to vote for the chair and vice chair, or if the committee wanted to proceed with that today.
I thought we had to do it today.
Well, we do. I asked Mr. Littlejohn prior to the meeting, and he said that we do have the ability to delay it one meeting.
Sure.
If
we've done that before, where there's less than the full membership of the committee is here, and the committee wants to wait. Nobody's gonna go to jail over that.
I don't mind proceeding only because I don't know that I've ever seen the full membership at any meeting personally, so I don't know that we're going to get more than what you guys think. So.
Okay, all right, so is that, it seems like the committee agrees with proceeding?
Do you have a preference?
How many are we missing?
We're missing two, so Ms. Callaway and Mr. Sills.
Oh, okay.
And then we have one vacant position that hasn't been filled yet.
Maybe
Okay.
they want to be the chair? Really? Can we vote them the chair if they're not here? Unless our current chair would like to continue.
No, the chair is timed out. Right?
Okay, yes. So with that, so since so Ms. Callaway is here, so we're then only missing one member. So since this is the first organizational meeting of the school year, I'm going to start with the meeting until we have the selection of the chair and vice chair. So with that, I'm going to call the meeting to order, and we're going to start with introductions.
Kevin McCormick, Director, Exceptional Student Education.
Karen Marcus here on behalf of Barbara McQuinn.
Kathy Gunlack on behalf of Karen Brill.
Sherry Brown for Erica Whitfield.
Jackie Callaway for District 7.
And Faith Schulstrom for Frank Barbieri, District 5.
Heather Knust, I'm the budget director and committee liaison.
Leanne Evans, Treasurer.
Ed Capitano, Principal of Loggers Run Middle School.
Alicia Steiger, Principal of Sunrise Park Elementary School.
Darren Edgecombe, Principal, Palm Beach Central High School.
Catherine Kerner, Principal of Independence Middle School.
Karen Wetzel, Principal, Suncoast High School.
Laura Littlejohn from the Office of General Counsel.
And Harvey Oaxaca, Director of Multicultural Education.
Okay, from the audience. Okay, so the next item is there any public comment? There is no public comment. So with that, we're going to proceed with the action items, the selection of the chair and vice chair. Board Policy 1.09 requires the committee to select a chair and vice chair at the first meeting after the start of the school year. So we'll start with the selection of the chair. An advisory committee member selected by committee members to serve as the committee's chair shall be limited to 4 consecutive years as the committee chair. The current chair, Ms. Faith Schulstrom, has served 4 consecutive years and is therefore no longer eligible. But I would personally like to just thank you for your participation and commitment. It does take a lot for the public. You know, these are unpaid positions and they are strictly voluntary. So we thank you as the chair and also the committee members for your continued participation. So with that, I will take nominations from the committee members for the chair.
I'd like to nominate Sherry Brown.
I'll second it.
Okay, are there any other nominations? Okay, since there are none, I will now, hearing none, all in favor of, or will you accept it?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh, did I say I'll get even under my breath?
All right, so hearing none, all in favor of electing Sherry Brown as the chair, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
I couldn't even get to saying the... Okay, since that is unanimous, Sherry Brown has been elected chair of the committee for the next school year. So, and then we can just go through the vice chair.
Oh, you don't want her to move up here?
No, we can wait till after the. Do we wait till after the?
Go ahead and do your vice chair elections.
That's why I asked Mr. Littlejohn to be here today to help me through this process. So I will now take nominations from the committee members for the vice chair.
I'd nominate Kathy Gunlick.
Second.
Do you? So do you accept? Do you accept the nomination? Are there any other nominations? Hearing none, all in favor of electing Dr. Kathy Gunlack as the vice chair, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Okay, it looks like it is unanimous. So Dr. Gunlack has been elected vice chair for the upcoming school year. Okay, with that, I will now pass it over back to our new chair, Sherry Brown. So we'll just take a short break. I don't know if you want to move over or if you want to stay.
I'm okay here for today. Is that all right with you, Faith? Okay. So next on the agenda is to approve the minutes from June 14th.
Move approval.
Do we have a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Moves unanimously. And then we're moving on to the 20 budget development update.
Okay, so this is our first meeting to kick off the budget development for FY20. The purpose of this meeting is really to give an overview of the budget development process and the timeline for the rest of the school year. The majority of our funding for the school district is really determined by the state legislature. And that process with the state kicks off around mid-September, as it did this year on September 14th, where the State Board of Education released their State Board of Education budget request and proposed budget request, as long as the long-range financial outlook, which was released by the Office of Economic and Demographic Research, and that's required to be released no later than September 15th of each year. They do updates then throughout the year, and there was an update more recently during December. So we'll pause for just 1 minute because I believe that maybe the computers have timed out.
I touched something and it.
Well, don't touch something.
Computers are scary. Yeah, these though, that's okay. Thank you.
No problem. And the governor normally releases his budget. His or her budget is usually released around the November timeframe. With the election of a new governor, that is a little bit delayed, and we expect that the governor's budget to be released in February. And then every other year, on the odd year, the actual session begins in March. On the even years, it begins in January. So this year, we're in an odd year, so this legislative session is not even going to start until March 5th. So around that time period is when we'll see the proposals from both the House and the Senate. And the regular session isn't going to end until May 3rd. The bulk of there is some local school board authority, and I am very happy to report that in the November election, the voters overwhelmingly approved increasing the quarter mill referendum to a full mill, which is going to equate to $150 million in additional funds for the school district dedicated for specific purposes. And so that it is fortunate that this year we will have some money to work with as a district to allocate funds out to the school sites tied back to those referendum initiatives. In addition to the mill, in November, we also have a penny sales tax that was also approved by the voters that will expire in 2026 or earlier if we collect the full anticipated revenue. So because of the lack of funding at the state level, we've really had to rely on our local community to help support public education in Palm Beach County. The State Board of Education legislative budget request, their proposal is $200 per student, an increase of 2.7%. We don't want to get too excited with that because they usually start at the high end of the range, and we usually end up much lower when we actually see what the legislators approve. But what I did notice when looking at the State Board of Education, they are proposing that a lot of the funds go back into categoricals. So go back into safe schools as well as mental health. And so whenever we have funding that's tied to categoricals, it really limits the flexibility of how those funds can be used. In looking at the fixed capital outlay, the State Board of Education is proposing that the capital outlay be fully funded, actually increase the charter school funding slightly as compared to the current year. The reason why I'm highlighting that is because that is something that we're going to have to monitor based on the legislation that was approved last year. If the state doesn't fund the capital outlay at the same level that they did in the previous year, the district is supposed to make up that portion. So if it is not, at least the $145 million and possibly even more, depending on if there's growth in charter schools, districts potentially could be required to make up that shortfall. And so it does look like the State Board of Education, their recommendation is to fully fund that, but it's something that we're going to continue to monitor. They're also proposing to continue a new education security grant that was passed this last legislative cycle, and that's for hardening of schools. So it's not for things like security guards, it's putting security film on windows. So it's actual hardening of the school facilities. There are other initiatives that are outside of FEFP. The State Board of Education is proposing to maintain the Best and Brightest program, as well as the Guardian program, and adding some minor other programs. And keep in mind, these are all, when we're looking at numbers of $10 million and $24 million, this is funding statewide. This is not for just Palm Beach County. So now moving on to the long-range financial outlook, was released, like I said, in September, mid-September, was updated on December 26th. And what I'm trying to show here is that in the past, going back 15 years, 20 years ago, if we looked at what the increase in the state general revenue was, and I can't say that I was around, but Mr. Burke was, and that is one thing that I did forget to mention. Mr. Burke is up in Tallahassee today. There is a lawsuit that he's representing the district on related to charter schools. He didn't have an option to not be here. So he did want me to make sure to relay that his choice would have been here. But what he would say that, in the past, we could always tie whatever the increase in per student funding was to whatever the projected increase in the state general revenue was, because the bulk of the state funding for education purposes comes from general revenue. But that really there's been a disconnect over the past, say, 10 years where we're seeing our per student increase is much less. That's the blue line on the chart. It's much less than the increase in the general revenue, which is the gray line. The red line is inflation, and the blue line is the per student increase that we've seen over the past few years. And you can see that the increase in per student funding is well below inflation and well below the increases that we're seeing in general revenue. The reason for that are there's a lot of competing priorities at the state level, looking at health and human services and Medicaid funding, as well as higher education. In December, the revenue outlook was adjusted. They adjusted the FY19 projected revenue was increased, the revenue growth was increased, but for the future years, they actually ended up decreasing what their original projected growth was for general revenue, just because they think that we're going to start to see a stagnation. We have seen significant growth, and they don't expect that to continue. And with that long-term financial outlook, they are projecting a 1.16% increase in per student funding. The way that they calculate that increase is they look at the average 3 years, They always do a look back of the prior 3 years in order to project out what they think the increase in per student funding will be going forward. When we're looking at these two charts, it's a chart from the long-range financial outlook from last year, and then in the upper left-hand corner and in the lower right-hand corner is the same chart but for the current year. And you can see that if we looked at the forecast for last year, that pre-K or K-12 education looked like it had the highest need and the highest demand on the state budget. And this is, keep in mind, it's just the state portion is not considering the local portion. When you look at the current long-range outlook, you can see that education dropped down to 6th. And it's not because we don't have any less need, but it's just that how they're changing the assumptions. So in the prior year long-term outlook, the outlook was assuming that the legislature was going to roll back the RLE to the exact same amount, whatever it needed to be, to not have any increase in property taxes. So that meant that there was going to be less money that they were going to be collecting from local taxes, so then the state budget was going to be responsible for more of it. They were also assuming an increase of 1.79% in per student funding. So now fast forward to this year, what the outlook is assuming is that they're going to allow the required local effort to increase by the value of new construction, and then they reduce the per student increase from that 1.79% down to 1.16. So by doing that, there's going to be, more of a burden on the local taxpayers. They also reduce some of what the need would be based on reducing what we're actually going to be getting per student. So that's why it looks like there's less of a need from a state perspective. But this can change very quickly depending on what the legislature does with the RLE. Is it going to roll back? Are they going to roll it back to exactly what it is, not allowing for any increase in new construction? Because that's really going to put a burden on the state budget and also limit the amount of funding, potential increase that we're going to see on a per student basis. And so that is a significant assumption that we have to monitor and look at each year as we're working through the legislative session. And this is just a very similar chart. If we were to look at the forecast from last year, you see that, if you look at the where it is highlighted in the red, and you see the purple box of the, the 1.1 shortfall of the $1.1 billion, you can see that that's what it was last year based on the new assessments and changes based on the assumption that FY20 was looking like there was going to be a deficit, but now based on the changes of assumptions, this year it's looking like FY20, there's actually going to be a surplus of $200 million. So the state budget is still structurally imbalanced because we do see deficits in year 2 and 3, so in 21 and 23, but there's still a lot of assumptions, there's still a lot of unknowns out there. But it did decrease significantly from the forecast from the previous year. The other unknowns, in addition to just looking at the RLE, is also the impact of the hurricanes. We had recently Hurricane Michael, previous to that Hurricane Irma, and that does put significant demands on the state. There's a lot of outflow that has to be made at the state level as well as the local level prior to getting reimbursement from the federal government. There are certain match requirements that I know that they're working through, and so the state has highlighted this as a significant issue or concern as to what is the actual reimbursement going to be and what is the ultimate demand going to be related to these hurricanes. So that we'll be monitoring that as well. So this is a historical look at where we've started from proposed increase in per student funding to how we actually ended up. And you can see that the State Board of Education is usually, for the most part, on the higher end of the range as to where we end up with our final increase in per student funding. And over the past 3 years, we've been around that 1% range. And so that's why it's likely that that's where it's going to continue. But if you look there at the bottom, you can see the increase in per student funding ranging from $71 to $101 But looking at the breakout between the base student allocation and the categoricals, that's what's so disconcerting, because if you look at last year, or, for the current year we're in right now, FY19, there was a $100 increase in per student funding, but only 47 cents of that was an increase in base student allocation, whereas where the district has the actual flexibility of how those funds are going to be spent. The categoricals are going to be your increase in transportation, increase in the mental health and the safe schools, digital classroom allocations. So those funds that are allocated are mandated to be used for that particular purpose. And so that's our concern going forward, is where are we going to see the increase in funds? And even if we see an increase of $100 or $200 per student, it may already be mandated and dedicated as to how we're going to have to use those funds. So we don't know, since the legislative session hasn't started yet, where we're going to end up. But I wanted to look at a proposal of what would 1.16% increase in per student funding actually even look like to us. And so if we were to start with an increase of $22 million, and that would be net of an increase in charter schools, we'd have to automatically set money aside to cover the contingency. We are expecting an increase in the FRS rate. We've had an increase the past 2 years. They did release a report in December, which shows an expected about $100 million shortfall. So our portion, approximate portion of that would be about $2.5 million increase in our FRS rates that the district would have to pay. That would not be for the employees, but the employer portion. We do expect to have a growth of enrollment, but we expect it to slow down significantly. We knew that the state had over-projected enrollment for us this year. They initially, when the long-range outlook was released, our enrollment was projected to increase in September by 1,500 students in FY20. After the October survey count, the EDR went back and they reviewed and they've adjusted the statewide enrollment numbers quite significantly. So they do still think that the state is going to grow, but by 18,000 fewer students than what they had originally anticipated. So our district is going from potential growth of 1,500 students down to probably closer to 700 or 800 students. And then with charter schools we'll likely see a split between growth in district schools and charter schools. So if we have an increase of enrollment, we also have to set aside staff in order to cover that increase of enrollment, so that comes off the top. And then looking at the proposal from the State Board of Education, they're already saying they want to set the money aside in safe schools and mental health, so we'd have to pull that out of what was available. If we wanted to then set aside something for employee salaries equal to that increase of 1.16%, that would only be $11 million, so a 1% raise potentially for employees, and we're already at a deficit. And this is just a high level without getting into the details. There's a lot of other assumptions and items that would have to be included, but 1.16%, it really isn't enough for just general operations.
Can I ask a question?
Yep.
So where does the newly approved half mil, whatever it was, $0.75 mil, how does that supplement, or does it?
It will.
Okay.
And so
So when we say it's 11 million for raises, it's actually 11 on top?
On top of whatever would be set aside for the referendum.
And the referendum, we have total flexibility. Tallahassee can't tell us where to spend any of it.
They can't tell us where to spend it. We have to spend it how we told the voters we would spend it.
Okay.
And so we have to be very careful with keeping the referendum dollars separate from the FEFP dollars, because even though the state funding is bleak and is minimal and is not looking good in any way, we are very thankful that the voters did approve the referendum, because we would be in a very different position right now if they had not. So we now do have the potential to actually increase and add resources at the school sites, but we cannot use those funds to balance any shortfall or deficit within the general fund. So we have to make sure that we're being very specific to tie everything that we're adding back to what we said with the referendum language, We do have a separate committee that is established to review on a quarterly basis, that we are, that how we allocated those funds is consistent with what's in the referendum language, because we're going to have to go back to the voters in 4 years and prove that we spent it exactly how we said we were going to spend it. So it is expected to generate an additional $150 million. And the additional $50 million for the quarter mill that we already have. So it's $150 million in addition to what we've already been generating. And those referendum dollars really do tie back to the strategic initiatives and long-term goals of the district. There are still a lot of other areas and issues. We're very early in the process that we're going to continue to monitor. We did talk about last year the study with the district cost differential. The district cost differential is one part of the FEFP allocation that adjusts for cost of living. And Palm Beach County has the highest DCD cost differential. So we get 4% on top of our per student funding just based on what's been categorized as the cost of living, that it's more expensive to live in Palm Beach County than in other areas. It's calculated through this Florida price level index. Miami-Dade County was really pushing last year that there is a review of how this DCD is calculated. We're expecting the new methodology and proposal to come out in January. We were concerned that since we are the highest, that the only way to go would be down. But in talks with Miami-Dade County, Mr. Burke has spoken with the chief financial officer at Miami-Dade County. And they had more of a discussion of the understanding of what changes they're looking at within the methodology. And so there is still the potential that will at least stay the same or possibly even increase, depending on the results of this review when it comes out in January. So we're going to continue to monitor that because that could have a significant impact in Palm Beach County. We are also monitoring the constitutional amendments that were passed. Amendment 5 is the one that was related to the supermajority of a tax, that the legislature, that any increase in taxes would have to be approved by a supermajority. And so that would include the RLE. So if the RLE is anything greater than the rollback rate, they would need a supermajority in order to approve that. So we're monitoring that to see how that impacts what they end up doing with the RLE. There was also another piece that was added into the FEFP calculation last year. It was a compression allocation, and it was, it's a complicated calculation, but to keep it short, Palm Beach County doesn't benefit from it. So that was $56 million that was really taken out of the FEFP allocation and reallocated to other districts. The State Board of Education proposal does not include that compression allocation again this year. So that's potentially would free up $50 million for maybe another, maybe increasing safe schools or mental health allocation. But we'll be monitoring that to see if that's something that's either included in the FEFP calculation or whether it's reallocated to something that we may benefit for in Palm Beach County. And we already talked about the charter school capital outlay and really monitoring that and what that impact would be to us if it's not fully funded by the state. So we did have our first board workshop in December 5th with the board. This is our first kickoff meeting with the Budget Advisory Committee. Our next meeting is scheduled for the 14th. And we'll go over these more dates later on. So looking at our FY20 budget, this chart should look somewhat familiar. So what I did is we added in the referendum as a separate piece of the pie. In the past, I've always just included that within the school portion, but I thought it was important, especially with the dollar amount, that it be broken out into a separate component. So that not only includes the $150 million, but the $50 million from the fine arts allocation that used to be included within that school district piece of the pie. So we're going to walk through each of these different components of the budget and the process that we go through through the budget development process. So there is a lot of overlap We already started working on the FY20 budget before the FY19 budget was approved by the board in September. As keep in mind, our fiscal year starts July 1st, even though our final budget isn't adopted by the board due to statute until September. From there, we've also been working on components of items that we talked about with the committee last year, changes related to the ESC allocation and the ELL allocation. We've been getting feedback from those pilot schools. In December, we selected a vendor for both the electronic IEP system as well as for the ELL compliance system. Those will be going to the board in February. And the purpose of those, as we talked about with the committee, was really to reduce the administrative burden on the school-based staff, to really free up their time so that they could work more with the actual students, what they're truly intended to do. So after board approval from there, we'll be able to start piloting and implementing that within this school year, and then we can start laying out the plan and process to roll it out into next school year. We don't intend to go district-wide. It will be just a phased-in rollout approach. The next step is so we've been working internally as to what proposals and changes we're going to be making to the school-based allocations. From there, we then present those recommendations to the academic cabinet. We'll be doing that next week on January 15th. And that includes the regional and instructional superintendents and other academic leadership. We'll be getting input from that group. Then on the 16th, we'll be meeting with the Superintendent's Budget Review Committee. The Superintendent's Budget Review Committee consists of 3 principals from each level from varied student populations so that we can try to get the input and feedback from as many as possible.
I have a question, please. Yep. For the selected PCG for the electronic IEP and ELL compliance system, were the recommendations submitted from the ESC department, and then from there, the selection was made? How was that process done? It went through the purchasing department, so we had an RFP. We released an RFP. Vendors were allowed to apply. We actually went through the process twice. On the committee, we had ESC was represented as well as ELL, and also IT, since it does have a heavy IT component and aspect to it as well. So it went through the district's normal procurement process. Mm-hmm. And like I said, we actually went through it twice. So we went through the process. We decided that we wanted to make some changes, make some be more specific in certain areas being addressed, and then we reissued the RFP for a second time, and so that's why the vendors weren't selected until December. But I do have both Kevin McCormick and Harvey Awaka here from ESC and ELL to answer. I thought there might be questions on these programs, so they'll be able to answer any specific questions that you have. Okay. Do you have any now? Well, my only question is qualitatively. I know you were looking a lot from the technical standpoint in terms of how easy it would be for the school staff to be able to do that. But with regards to the actual qualitative, instructional, academic piece, whether or not that aligns with what it is that we're trying to do academically for our students, not just how you put things through a computer.
Well, I can address the ESC portion of that. We did develop the scope of the RFP. Within that scope of the RFP, we had requirements that the system would be able to be integrated within Performance Matters, which is where we keep all of our assessment data. So we can pull our assessment data for students straight into the IEP. To assist with goal writing, to assist with present levels and progress monitoring. We added also a progress monitoring service aspect to the program to make sure that our teachers can log their service and performance of their students on those goals within the IEP system to be able to try to increase both skills and academic outcomes.
And in terms of the ELL system, which is different than PCG, but it's a similar system, ours does the same exact thing, but there's also a component that allows, once the compliance paperwork is done, it maps instructional strategies to students' needs, which will allow us, and then there's instructional strategies that we've already been training on for the last couple of years. So it's a nice pairing to take the compliance to the instructional level to make it that much easier for our staff to integrate those into the system for each individual student at the school level.
Okay,
So-
thank you.
Ms. Callaway, I
Yes.
did address the academic aspect of it, but I know you understand our systems and our
Yes.
processes. It's a very rigorous compliance aspect to ESE programming. All of the compliance aspects of this program will be integrated. So the goal is to put information in once, and that information to populate across the plan, as well as get pushed into SIS. So we don't have people putting the same information in multiple places, which is the whole intent to save on our human resources, our time.
Okay, thank you for your clarification.
And it's similar for the ELL as well, just to make it that much easier. Also to oversee and be able to help support schools, so we can look at them at a district level, at a school level, at a region level, a lot more effectively.
And you did get input from the schools, is that correct? From that? Thank you.
Yes.
So, just to be clear, you won't, for example, an SLP won't need to do multiple forms of the same information that they've had to do now.
Correct.
So it'll be one form, easier to manage than having to do what we used to do.
Correct.
That got lost in space.
And I do have to say there are some parts of our system. PCG, the Easy IEP, is the system that won our bid. They operate in several counties throughout the state. And so our processes are a little different than other counties. So we will have development hours to make sure that our IEP goals transfer directly into the plan of care, which is what you're referring to with the speech and language pathologists. That will be happening in the first phase when we start to integrate the system into our system.
Now, the two systems don't integrate with each other, or can they?
They can talk to each other. They don't necessarily integrate into one another, but both systems integrate to our current systems. And for students who are duly identified, we can work together at some level, and that's part of our developments. Work together.
And part of what we learned through this process, I've learned a lot about ELL programming and compliance.
Likewise.
And what we've learned is we have very different needs and requirements based on our programs, which is why we couldn't find one solution. Part of the reason why we couldn't find one solution.
Yeah, because that was the initial goal, was to have one solution for both ESE and ELL. Going through the process, though, we realized that there were organizations, entities that really focus and have been doing ESE for 20 years, and those that are really focusing on ELL. And we just felt like the committee really felt like we would be shortchanging our students if we went with one that just specialized in ESE. We'd be shortchanging those ELL students and vice versa. And so that was why, we decided to actually go back out, be more specific as to what we were looking for, to try to come up with the best system to meet the needs of both student populations and really streamline what our current process is right now. It's not supposed to be additional work for the schools. It's really supposed to relieve that administrative burden that they have right now. So after presenting to that superintendent's budget review committee, which includes representatives from the principal group, it also includes leadership staff from the district. Then we'll go out to each of the division meetings, high school, elementary, and middle school. And I can tell you that's my favorite time of year, going and presenting these ideas to, such a large group. And, elementary especially, you can have 80 different principals, and they all have their own priorities. So me trying to keep them on track with, no, that's not really what we're talking about right now. So those are always a challenging time of year. But that is the time where they can vent and really tell us truly what they're looking for and their needs are. And even though we might not be able to accomplish it in this upcoming year, it's something that we always keep in mind for future years. Yep.
We actually have a high school principals meeting next week, and we're having a steering committee meeting today. Can we add you to the agenda
Yes, you
for next
can.
week?
Yes, because I was going to talk to you after this meeting to let you know to add me. And Mr. McCormick, as well as Mr. Awaka, will be attending with me because there is a large component related to ESE and ELL. So after those division meetings, then we reconvene the Superintendent's Budget Review Committee because for those principals that didn't feel comfortable giving us input during those meetings, it gives them time to talk to their principal representatives so that when we come back and reconvene for that final meeting with the Superintendent's Budget Review Committee, they can share any concerns. And really at that time, that's where we're going to lay out that these are what the proposed allocation changes are going to be for the FY20 school budgets. Because school budgets are really based on enrollment and staffing, and that's how we allocate out units and develop the budget for that school piece of the pie. Then our Budget Advisory Committee would follow after that. That's on February 14th. And we're due to release school budgets no later than February 20th. Principals have been pushing us the past few years to keep pushing up when we release school budgets so that they can start recruiting and hiring to try to retain and find the best qualified teaching staff since we're competing with Martin as well as Broward and Miami-Dade. The voter-approved referendum dollars, that's that second piece of the pie, is really going to follow, for the most part, the same timeline as for the schools. We're going to continue to fund over 650 fine arts teachers, and then we have the additional funding which we're going to be used for the recruitment and retention supplements for teachers, and then the other piece of it is school security as well as mental health. So we're working on right now what those allocation models would be. For charter schools, yes?
Quick question about the school psychologists. Is there any thought to increasing their contract rather than waiting to the last minute and scrambling to see who can show up?
We are looking at options that include maybe adding additional duty days during the summer months. And that way it would give a way to give flexibility for those who want to work versus those who don't want to work those summer months. So that is something that we are considering so that they can kind of catch up over the summer and really hit the ground running when school starts. And I know that was something that was stressed by Mr. Oswald and something that we're looking at and possibly will be proposed to.
So a flexible type contract.
Right, through extra duty days is something that we were considering right as of now.
You know what I'm saying, right?
Yeah, but I just want to clarify, I don't believe we're revisiting the contract.
Okay.
We're just offering additional extra duty days. Historically, we've only added extra duty days for the 60-day timeline.
Okay.
Requirement.
Right.
That is expanding to all backlog for psych evals to be able to catch up and start fresh at the beginning of the next school year. That's the intent.
Good luck.
Can you tell me how many MTSS coaches there will be?
We are working through that right now, what the proposals will be. And I have another meeting this week with Mr. Oswald. We're meeting internally. And then, like I said, from there, we're also going to be then vetting those ideas through the school principals and whatnot as well. What they're trying to be very careful to have the mindset of not just adding positions to add positions, but looking at the positions we currently have and making sure to align those positions. So we're just not adding additional staff to the school site. And it's really thought out what positions will be added and what their job duties will be. So it's consistent from school to school.
And how many do we have now?
For the MTSS coaches, we have 20, I believe, and those are shared among a certain set of schools. There are some schools that do have a dedicated MTSS coach. It depends on the needs of the students at that school site. Right now, it's managed through the Safe School Department. So we are looking at that model, trying to look at those resources that we currently have, whether they're providing a purpose and we're going to add additional units on top of that, or looking at what the duties of the counselors are and different other positions at the school site, and how we can really align them. And like I said, make sure that the job duties of the positions are understood, so it's being consistent from school to school as to how these positions are being treated.
Now, are these coaches across all grade levels, elementary, middle, and high, or just focused at the high school? I mean, where are they?
For the 20 that we have right now, I would have to get back to you to be certain. I believe it covers all grade levels, and it's really based on the specific needs of the students, that they're targeting specific schools that have been highlighted as needing additional supports. But I can provide you a list of where those current MTSS coaches are being used.
And can you, in the future, provide us with a job description and the training required to do those positions, what they're expected to do?
Yes, I can do that, because I remember at one of our meetings last year, we had a draft job description. So I'll make sure to bring that forward to the next meeting as to what the actual job duties are.
Okay, because I have a question. I don't know what they do. I mean, I kind of know what they do, but I don't know what their training and background is. I mean, like school psychologists are specific background, other people are. So what their requirements are and what they do.
Okay, and we, like I said, yeah, there was something that we presented last year, but I'll make sure to bring that forward to the next meeting.
Good, thanks.
I think that's a good question, because when you were talking about the guidance counselors and whether or not they would supplement guidance, I think it's really important that we have that information, because are they supposed to be, or should they be acting as an extension of a guidance counselor, something totally different, offering a specific kind of service that does not, that's not the same as what a guidance counselor. So I'm not sure either, so I appreciate that information. Thanks for bringing that up.
Okay, and that's why they're being very thoughtful. This is on the academic side, and Mr. Oswald specifically being very thoughtful as to how these positions are going to be allocated and their actual use and purpose of them. So that is definitely going to be brought back at the next meeting.
Okay, because if it's a guidance counselor, then it's an additional funding then for guidance counselors. If it's something that's totally different, then we should, know that.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes, yes, and that will be laid out in the next meeting.
All right.
For the Budget Advisory Committee.
Thank you.
The next two meetings, because some of them are going to have some department impact. So we'll have, those that are going to be allocated specifically to the schools will be addressed at the next meeting, and then also the department meeting will be at the April meeting. So the next piece of what we look at when we're building the budget is, what is the charter school enrollment going to look like? And as you can see from FY11 to 2015, we had a significant spike in the number of students in charter schools. It's really leveled off over the past few years, but it really is dependent on, how many new schools are going to open, the growth of the charter schools, what schools are going to close. We had a couple, we had a very high profile closure last year. We do notice that, when there are closures, it doesn't necessarily mean they're coming back to district schools. They do come back to district schools, but a lot of times they go into other charter schools. And we do see a lot of movement within charter schools of students moving from school to school. So we expect, as of right now, even with adding adding possibly up to 4 new schools, right now we're projecting around an increase of 300 to 400 students in charter schools, but it really is difficult to project, because we don't know where those schools are going to be located. They don't have to tell us until right before a school opens. So it's always a challenge each year with estimating what the charter school impact is going to be.
Do you have any way to keep track of students coming back from charter schools?
We do, and the FTE department, that's something that they monitor. I know that there has been questions in the past saying how many students are we losing, or are we getting from charter schools right after that October count, so where they're getting funding from it, but we're not. But we really did see that it was pretty neutral, that yes, we might have gained some students, but we might have lost some students too. So we didn't see a really significant financial impact of like a drain of a loss of funds. But we do see that the charter students tend to stay within charter schools. You know, so that's why, you know, so when they are moving from school to school or there is a closure, a lot of times it is just students moving between charter schools. That's not to say that we don't get students back, we definitely do, but we do see movement between the charter schools. But it's also, it's a moving target. You know, it really is difficult to know, you know, it's up to 4 schools because at the last minute, 2 could decide to defer. You know, so it's just trying to plan as to how many potential students they're going to have growth-wise has just been difficult, but it has been pretty stagnant and consistent the past few years. But we really haven't had many new schools opening either.
Saturated the market.
Yeah, exactly. It at some point it does, you know, so they're just cannibalizing students from each other, and that's what we're seeing is that there are a lot of charter schools that, you know, looking back 10 years ago, prior to having this significant growth that had enrollment of 800 students that are now at the point that they're, you know, close to 200 students and at the point of potential closure just because those students have left and gone to other charter schools. And so the more competition that they have with charter schools, they're really just taking students from each other. So the next piece is looking at our department budgets. And our department budgets, that was about 8% of piece of the pie when you're looking at the total district budget. And department budgets are developed completely different than school budgets. School budgets are really based on enrollment and a staff allocation model. But departments were really looking at, you know, what the current spend has been for the current year and really justifying by a line item that really is needed and necessary for the next year. When you look at the department budget, though, over 30% of the department budget is just transportation. So transportation is a significant component when you're looking at what makes up the total departments. We released a bulletin to the department heads on November 2nd, just letting them know that they need to prepare for FY20. Staff in my department have been meeting with each of the department heads, you know, talking to them about, you know, what to expect for their budget for the upcoming year, that they really need to look and justify each of their line items, you know, letting them know that, you know, it doesn't really look good from a state funding perspective. So we have to really look at how we're spending our dollars, how to realign them, existing dollars, because we're not expecting to have new funds from the state. And then, you know, after we work through that whole process, each department head meets one-on-one with the superintendent and executive leadership. And that takes place over a week where each department head is really justifying and defending their budget line by line. And then from there, after we go through that process, we'll be presenting any changes within the department budgets at the April 18th meeting for the Budget Advisory Committee. So the other pieces of the budget are, we don't have as much control over in the sense that it's not related to K-12 activities. So after school and summer camp, those are all fee-based programs. We expect their budget to be about the same as this year, so around $40 million. We currently serve 94 elementary after-school programs. We have adult and community education. Adult and community ed is a workforce. We receive workforce funding from the state of Florida. That funding has to be used for workforce. It cannot be used for K-12 activities. So that we have to make sure that whatever funding is remaining rolls over and is used for adult education. It also includes the community education programs that we have at each of our school sites, and that's considered fee-based and has to be self-sustaining. VPK, we get specific money from the state related to VPK, and in addition, that's also a fee-based, combined with a fee-based program, and that also has to be self-sustaining, and we carry forward those funds and keep them specifically for VPK activities. And then we just have our, the other piece of it, or the last piece, is the school internal account, where there's where anything that the schools purchase, which are position-wise, they're utilizing custodians to service leases, or we have our school police officers that they use them for additional activities. That's all runs through a specific funding source that's then reimbursed by the schools through their internal accounts where they've generated fees for the athletics and whatnot, or fees from the leases in order to cover those different costs.
So those are basically all cost neutral to the district?
Correct, yeah.
The parent fees for the voluntary pre-K program, what are those? What are they asking the fees for from the parents? What are they actually paying?
For VPK,
You have state and parent fees.
because the VPK funding doesn't pay for all of the students or the whole portion of the fee, because it's based on a moving scale based on the financial income of the parent. And so then there's a certain amount that the parent has to contribute.
And VPK only covers a 4-hour day, so if they stay all day, they have to pay
for the additional
afternoon
amount.
or morning, whatever.
Yeah, because VPK only pays for 3 hours,
Yeah.
I believe, of the school day.
Okay.
Right, and so then the next piece, when we're looking at, thinking of the budget and looking at the piece of the pie, there's a chunk that is for school-wide and county-wide costs. And so there's always some confusion as to really what's included in there. And those are things, for the most part, that are going to be allocated to schools, but we can't allocate them to schools until we know what the actual amount is going to be. For example, when we're closing out our current year, there's going to be a certain amount of funding that's going to carry over to the schools, but until we close out that year, we don't know what the actual amount is. So we have to estimate what we think the amount of carryovers are going to be for advanced placement exams or industry certifications, where it's specific funding that has to be carried over and allocated back to that school site. We have to wait till we close out that year until we actually allocate it back out to the schools. We also put in here our estimates for the state categoricals until we determine how they're going to be budgeted and used. And so a lot of those costs, even though it looks like it's not being utilized for the schools, a bulk of those costs really are going to be allocated to the schools. It's just kind of a holding area until we have the exact number to allocate to them. And then there's certain costs that we just pay that are district-wide, including certain insurance policies and certain claims and judgments, but really the bulk of it is the school costs. There is a portion that we do set aside related to potential revenue that we might have to pay back to the state. What we were seeing for several years is that the state estimates how much revenue we're going to receive based on enrollment. That's still based on a projection as well. And so if they overestimate or they underestimate what the enrollment growth is going to be statewide, then they're going to end up pulling revenue back from us during the school year. So we always set some money aside in case we do have a holdback from the state, where during the year we're going to have to end up where they reduce the amount of FEFP funding we're going to receive.
Could I ask, so is that why the BP oil spill is in there?
No, the BP oil spill money was money that we received related to, it was almost in the sense found money related to the BP oil spill. And so we set that money aside, and since it's one-time non-recurring funds, we're utilizing it for purposes that are really one-time non-recurring.
No, I just didn't realize everybody got a little bit of it.
Yes, we were surprised when we ended up getting some money related to that, but that is the funding source that we used when we were going through the referendum, and we were paying for certain costs and expenses related to the referendum. We were able to utilize that source of funds. The past couple years, we have also been setting aside a small amount of funds for hurricane preparation or storm preparation, because we don't know when we're getting a storm whether it's going to actually be declared an emergency and potentially reimbursable by FEMA. But there's a lot of prep work we have to do regardless of that, and we have to make sure that we have enough money set aside for the purchase orders. So we do set aside some funds now to cover that in case there is a storm or hurricane. So we're ready, and there's that we have no anticipated slowdown and can cover that since it is unexpected when they come. So the next piece of the budget is the capital maintenance transfer. capital maintenance transfer is about $100 million. And that's for anything that qualifies for capital funding, but doesn't qualify as a capitalizable type project to be recorded in the capital projects fund. So for example, property and flood insurance, that's something we're allowed to use capital money for, but there's no way we can record it in the capital projects fund because it's not a capitalizable type item. So we're allowed to then transfer money from the capital projects fund to cover these activities that are allowable under capital projects. And then just the other pieces of the budget, you know, looking at our utilities, our phone and data. I mean, we spent $35 million, you know, with just FPL. I mean, we spend a lot of money for electricity. We expect that our utilities is going to be around the same amount. It's been pretty consistent from year to year. We did notice that we are seeing an increase in usage, but we've also been seeing a decrease in rate. So we're expecting that that's going to be pretty consistent with the current year. Our employee leave payouts have been pretty consistent as well. We're going to keep monitoring that because we might start to see a reduction depending on now with the referendum as to whether some people might elect to stay a little bit longer than they had in the past. And then we also have to make sure that we comply with our board contingency reserve and 3% of total appropriations. And so that's kind of an overview of the general fund budget, what we're looking at and how it's going to be developed in the current year. And now Ms. Evans is going to go through the capital projects budget and debt service budget. Would you like to continue or would you like to take a quick break?
Take a quick break.
Okay, we'll take a quick 5-minute break and then we'll go through the capital projects.